When I was young, I thought the idea of death haunted me very constantly. For decades, I would say. When I woke up in the morning, the first thought on my mind was, there isn't much time, you better get going. And I learned that that wasn't the case for most people. They weren't haunted by death the same way that I was. It was probably partly, I have a proclivity to depression that seems to be familial, and that was probably a manifestation of that. But I don't really think, it doesn't haunt me now, partly because I know that there are things that are much worse than death. And so that's a terrible thing to know, but it's also a useful thing to know. There are things that are far worse than death. There are things that you should be properly much more afraid of than just death. So it doesn't haunt me now. I try to make the most of the moment, aim up and make the most of the moment. That's the ethos of the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. Aim at the highest goal you can contemplate and then pay attention to the moment. And that's the antidote to death anyways, in some real sense. Because doing that makes what you're doing so engaging that it chases all the thoughts of mortal self-consciousness from the theater of your imagination. If you're engrossed enough in the moment, and I think you can be engrossed enough in the moment for that to happen if what you're pursuing is of sufficient value. If you're afraid of death, take a look at how you're living and see if you're all in. And maybe if you're all in enough, that's good enough. I think that's right. And then I think also, if you're all in and death visits, and it's impending, you could say to yourself, I did everything that I was here to do. At least then you're not going to torture yourself with that as you're facing death. That's something too. Imagine you lived your life fully. And that would mean that you said what you had to say when you had to say it. You did what you needed to do when you needed to do it. And you availed yourself of every opportunity that came your way, right? So you'd exhaust yourself in the service of your life, let's say. Maybe by the time you were old, you'd have had enough, and you could just let go. And, you do see this with people, is that, and we kind of know this even when we grieve, maybe you have a relative who's 95 and they die, and people are sad, but you say, well, they lived a full life, and the fuller the life, the less, in some ways, the less catastrophic the demise appears to be. And so it might be that if you fully exhausted yourself, that your life would be enough. I asked my parents once if they could take a drug that would return them to being 18 physically, but they had all the wisdom that they'd accrued over the years. They wouldn't lose that if they would do it. They didn't say yes right away. I don't know if they ever did tell me what they had decided, but it was interesting to me that they didn't say no right away either, But it was interesting that they had to think about it, because you'd think that if you were offered something approximating immortality and health, you'd take it. And maybe you would, but then here's an alternative proposition, and I don't know. It's not like I'm not trying to maintain myself, if I could extract out an extra decade or an extra 20 years, keeping myself healthy, that seems like a good thing. Would I want to live 500 years? Whew, that's a long time, man. 1,000 years? I don't know. That's a long time. But the alternative is, truncated existence with death. And that's also not particularly palatable. And so is there a medicament for mortality?